Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look at things that we can do to help ourselves to achieve more in the ministry. And today we have Dr. Danny Dwyer with us. He has a bachelor's degree from Welch College, a master's in Pauline Studies, and a PhD from Columbia Pacific University in Pastoral Theology. Dr. Dwyer has served as a pastor. He's also held various leadership positions among Free Will Baptists. He taught pastoral theology for 14 years at Southeastern Free Will Baptist College, and he's also served as vice president there and dean of students. He's been serving as a senior pastor a few years ago there at Cramerton Free Will Baptist Church until he kind of retired in 2015. And then he began to work where many of you may know of his work with Rekindle, working with churches, trying to help revitalize them and in some cases even merge in different situations. So he's done some really important work. We're so glad to have you here with us, Dr. Dwyer. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Dr. Moody. It's a privilege and an honor to do this. Thank you.
Well, you've done a lot of work with our churches, and a lot of pastors and probably even lay people are out there, and they're perhaps concerned their church is not growing as they had hoped that it would. And tell us a bit about why assessment is so important for the pastor himself and then for the church.
It's just a great question, and it is the heart of all of this ministry of Rekindle. A little broader perspective, the best figures, the best statistics across the board are that 85% of our churches, in fact in all denominations, are plateaued and or declining. Of that 85%, up to 40, maybe as much as 50% of those churches are perhaps within 5 years, perhaps of closing. And of that 40 to 50%, many of those churches are going to close pretty quickly unless something happens. And so that's where Rekindle and church revitalization comes in. And trying to address that, trying to meet the need, trying to prevent that from happening. I believe that's the Lord's will for us, to do everything we can to try to address that need. And in the process, save some perhaps. Now, assessment is essential. Because, first of all, it's rooted biblically. Wherever you turn in the Scriptures, spiritual renewal is a principle of Christian life. Romans 12, 1 and 2 and other texts. But then it's common sense as well to assess where you are, how you're doing. Are you accomplishing anything? Are you spinning your wheels? Let me talk about that in reverse order just a minute. Common sense-wise, in the world of business, for example.
Yes.
Every business that is going to be successful on any level is going to have to assess and does assess what it's doing, does it on a regular basis. It assesses its product, assesses its people, its workers, how they're accomplishing things, their profit margins and so forth. Assessment is just the right and smart thing to do.
They do it on a quarterly basis. They have all these reports come out, and so that's what really every other organization does, don't
Absolutely, yes. But spiritually, too. If you look in the Scriptures, the Lord has directed us to examine ourselves about renewal in our own lives, of putting off the old man, putting on the new man. But then in the church level, if you look at Revelation 2 and 3, you have 7 churches that the Lord himself is assessing and gives detailed analysis of what they are doing, how they need to correct, where they are, and then the consequences of what's going to happen if they do not make those corrections. And so that's the ultimate assessment of church revitalization, is the Lord himself. And one of the great principles that is both a blessing and frightening is the fact the Lord walks among his churches. He walked among the candlesticks or the lampstands that represented the churches, and he was assessing those. And so he is present in all of our churches, constantly looking at us because it's his church. We're only under shepherds of it. We're only trying to take care of the best we can. And so with that model of what Jesus does, then it ought to put us in a frame of mind to ask then Lord, what do we need to do? What do I need to do? Mm-hmm. And then you look at examples in the Scriptures of people that did great work. They're models of revitalization, let's say. The word probably is a modern usage word, but it's a good word. Nehemiah, for example, I think is one of the best models for revitalization. Here was a man who was a cupbearer who became a wall builder, which, by the way, is a great promise that anyone who will get it on his heart to do what the Lord wants him to do can go from a cupbearer to a wall builder with the right kind of heart, right kind of resources, and so forth. And in the book of Nehemiah, there are at least 10 great principles of church revitalization that were modeled in the renewal of City of Jerusalem. And then you look at Revelation 2 and 3, and you've got these 7 or 8 great principles there that all match. All of them have a common denominators with them with regard to leadership, spiritual life, and so forth. And so it's just a great need in our day.
And you see it all through the Scriptures. You could say Nehemiah was doing that in a different way, but pastors and perhaps even some of the work lay people today they're following in the footsteps, if you will, of Nehemiah.
I think so. And Nehemiah became for me a model for this. Years ago, when I started working with churches, before church revitalization became what we did, it was what we did. And so he became a model for me and a challenge for me. So I learned everything about Nehemiah that I could that helped me personally so much. And so I think it's just a great tool and a great need in our day. So how can we do that? How do we assess, and then how do we put it into practice? And that's where Rekindle comes into play. And how do we help our Free Will Baptist churches? Not dictate to them, not try to send them messages of what they ought to do, but come alongside and partner with them. After all, that's what we all are trying to do. We're trying to share the burden, share the load, share the ministry together. We're laborers together with the Lord in all of this. And so my heart of hearts about this was when I was asked to develop the program to try to figure how we could help. Then there are lots of these out there. There are lots of programs, but what is designed for us was my concern, was my interest. And so a lot of study, a lot of personal experience, and so forth. And so we have now 10 areas of church need that are would be true with every Bible-believing church, beginning with pastor and his wife, and then going through these key areas that every church needs to have strong in ministry in their churches, like pastor and his wife, but then prayer, stewardship, discipleship, outreach, soul winning. We talk about outreach, and we should in every way, but one of those things that especially is we need to love people where they are and win people to Christ. And so discipleship and those areas are 10 strategies, 10 areas with regard to Rekindle that are part of the assessment and application of what we do. Now, how do we get to that place? Of course, there's a huge factor with this because every church is at its own situation. Not every church would be the same. Now, there's an assessment tool that I've brought together from many different sources and trying to pick what fits us as Free Will Baptists. And in selecting what I believe fits us, then the assessment tool then becomes a way, not an absolute answer, but a way of helping to assess where a local church is. And so the way I go about doing that is meet with folks first, give these principles of spiritual renewal. So a pastor will call, will you come and talk with us? Sure. And so here's what I do, and then work with or present these principles to a local church and ask them to really pray for the Lord to help them be open to assessment. Now, Dr. Moody, that's one of the key areas with this. Is a pastor and his wife
Kind
and
of
then
looking at where
a
they're at.
church being open to doing that. Exactly.
So talk to us a bit about a pastor and his wife, which is where it really begins.
Yes.
Talk to us a bit about what they can do to kind of assess their own situation.
Now, that is probably the preeminent issue.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why is because we understand we have the same heart as pastors. But also the pastor is that under-shepherd. The Lord is the big shepherd, of course, the shepherd of the sheep. And the pastor is the shepherd of that flock in that sense. He's the under-shepherd. And he's responsible. And so he carries the calling and the character and the leadership necessary. But we're all aware that ministry can take a toll on a pastor and his wife. And here I think is a huge factor with what Rekindle does, my heart. In fact, my wife and I, if I mention, our heart is to try to help the pastor and his wife. And so assessing where the pastor is usually is more of a private thing in the sense that I want to talk with him and his wife privately and give them an instrument of assessment too that's separate from the church assessment. Pastor, where are you in your life? What about your devotional life? How about your preaching? You and your wife doing okay? And are you tired? How's your health? How's your health?
Yes.
Things of that nature.
Uh-huh.
And so this is where confidentiality comes to play, because I want to share the pastor's heart, but keep it all confidential as much as possible. And then in the days to come, regardless of whatever else you do with regard to the strategies, the first and foremost meeting that I have is with the pastor and his wife, and talk with them, pray with them, and then we have a couple of books we work through to help encourage them in ministry.
What are the books you use to help them to work through those things?
Well, there are a number of those, but the key one has to do with a recent study of pastors and trying to figure out the main needs for pastors and longevity in ministry. And so we take that book and we work through it. I want him and his wife to read that, and then we work through those 5 big principles of an ongoing long-range ministry in their lives.
So trying to keep them from quitting, to
Yes.
to keep going and look at some things they might be able to do to do that. So there's probably some pastors thinking, well, I can't do the Rekindle thing, or maybe I'm not in that bad a shape, they may think, at this particular point. What can they do on their own out there to assess their situation?
Well, that's a great question. And having been in that myself as a pastor, then what do we do?
Yes.
Well, we need men around us, for example, we can open our hearts to. We can share our hearts with. And I think that has to be, the best resource are other pastors. And so men who carry a heart to respect and so forth. But then there's some great books to read that help that pastor and his wife where they are and their own. They can get a book or two, and find the right references, and then sit down together and find a time of personal spiritual renewal in their lives. We all are busy in ministry. Ministry makes big demands on us, but periodically you have to have a time, a Sabbath as it were.
Yes.
Not just on every week, but sometimes a Sabbath time where you and your wife take the time for spiritual renewal.
So that's a big component if the pastor and his wife are not healthy. And
Yes.
it sounds like you're saying it's very important. They get another pastor, maybe someone that was once in a situation like they're in, but has gotten to a place that's better now and has some more experience behind them to kind of help them and coach them along.
Well, absolutely. And that's where I get a lot of phone calls about this, for which I'm very humbled to do that. In fact, before I came here, I got a call from a young preacher, what about this? But anyway, the point is that, yeah, I'm available, but in the sense of what I have learned, what I know, but there are lots of good men available who are glad to share their hearts and pray with others. And, we all need to have a pretty good prayer list of men around us we're praying for these
days. We
do,
yeah. and everybody needs to have in mind, especially folks younger in the ministry, someone that is a mentor that is working with them, and especially those that are older, they need to have some folks in mind that they're, as you said earlier, not being intrusive, but they're trying to be there and be a sounding board.
Exactly. And I really want to encourage pastors to be open to that. We pastors become sometimes embattled, and we put up perimeters around us to try to insulate ourselves. And the truth is that's necessary, but you also have to have resources. You also have to have reinforcements. And reinforcements in ministry come in spiritual forms: counsel, prayer, encouragement. However you get those, from a book, from words, from a conference, however you get them, it is absolutely essential that you do that. And I think I also want to mention again, I think the pastor's wife is almost an overlooked element with this. She especially is essential for the ministry and church revitalization. There's no more important person than the pastor's wife with that whole factor.
So pastors, that's something to pay attention to as you're listening in, and maybe pastors' wives realize how important you are, and then folks that are that are lay people think about that and be concerned about your pastor's wife. So
exactly.
The Scripture talks about having sober judgment. You mentioned Romans 12, and so we look at our strengths, we look at our weaknesses, we look at our relationship in this situation between like a pastor and his wife and where they're at spiritually. So let's think about a church, and let's think about folks that are listening in and saying, how could I go through and just assess my church to get a sense of where we're at and what we need to be working on?
Of course, Dr. Moody, there are pastors who do this and are very aware of assessment and so forth. I do this regularly in our ministry, but then you get to the place to where some churches do, some pastors do. How can I get some help with this? This is where Rekindle comes into play. And it is simply one of our programs, but it's one of our Free Will Baptist programs to help Free Will Baptist churches and leaders. And so if you use Rekindle, then give me a call. We set up a series of meetings, beginning with meeting to explain the process, giving folks time to pray about that. And then secondly, meeting with them, that church, to take the assessment, have an instrument of assessment that covers these big areas that most everybody in the church goes through and fills out the assessment instrument. And when you're done with that, what you have is you have all of your laymen in the church, plus I encourage visitors to do the same, because you get perspectives from them you may not get from your church. And so it's one service given to this, takes about 45 minutes to do it, but it's part of what you plan for, part of the preparation. And once they work through it, then I get the instrument, grade it, and then go back to the pastor first and say, here's what this looks like now. Here are the areas of strengths. Here are the areas of weakness. Now, right off the bat, every church is not going to be the same. This church may grade strong in this area, weak in this area. Church down the road, next county, next state may grade differently. It just depends on that church. And so it's not an instrument that dictates, it's an instrument that reveals. It reveals the thinking of the people in the church about that. And so it's an assessment, then I go back, here it is. Okay, now you know your strengths and weaknesses according to this instrument. And by the way, there's no instrument that I know of about this kind of a thing that is absolute. It gives you good insights, though. They're educated insights about these areas.
Some good direction.
Exactly. And so you go back, and then I say, here's where you're graded. Now, you need to take time to pray about this. But if you want to go further with the revitalization process, then let's set that up. We'll need a team. We'll need a time to meet. And then the coaching partnership, yes.
And so some churches, especially those that are like in danger of closing within 5 to 10 years, would have more difficulty in these areas. Some others might not have as many difficulties, but all of our churches could benefit in some way from assessment. And then by going through an assessment process, as you're describing, you're able to, if it's discipleship or stewardship or your prayer ministry, you're able to really put the effort where it needs to be, aren't you?
Exactly. And once those areas of strength, weakness particularly you focus on, once those areas are shown, then that's where the strategies of meeting and coaching and assisting the pastor, coming alongside the pastor to help him with these principles, these good books that laymen can read and get hold of, and then how to apply these truths, how to make them work in your church.
So it's truly not a one-size-fits-all.
Exactly. No, it is not.
Looking at our particular church, what our particular situation is, and addressing those needs. Well, Dr. Dwyer, this has been extremely helpful to us. We're going to have you back very soon talking about some of these areas, but we encourage all of our folks to go to our website, nafwb.org. You'll find some of the resources Dr. Dwyer has spoken about, and we encourage you, wherever you may be, to assess your situation, yourself personally, if you're a pastor, a pastor's wife, to assess your church, and to be getting the kind of help, iron sharpening iron, and then wherever you may be, looking for a way to help others out as well.
Exactly.
Thank you for your ministry, Dr. Dwyer, and thank you so much for stopping by today.
Thank you.